What an incredible presentation. I think we need part two, the next edition. Do you agree? Yeah, yeah. Again, to give a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Merci. I want to say there's also a lot of technical terms. It's a lot of information over 2 days. We will send you a link following the conference so that you can rewatch everything. Everything is being recorded, so everything you purchased a ticket, you will get. We will send you a link in the next few days, and you will have access to all of this information if you want to rewatch any presentation. We had a bit of a change in program because some of the speakers did not make it yet due to flight problem. So the next conference was going to be on regenerative agriculture. It's going to be tomorrow, and we took one of the conference from tomorrow today. I am just as excited to present the next speaker, Etienne Neethling. I met first Etienne actually through his writing. When I was writing my book, Quel vin pour demain, I was doing a lot of research, and it's how I came across Etienne. Etienne is a lecturer and a researcher in viticulture and enology at École Supérieure des Agricultures of Angers, and has written a lot on the subject of climate change in viticulture. And then I met in the Loire Valley, and then we met a few times. And I love what he does. I love his research, and in the context of climate change is a lot of talk about can we preserve local identity? What is local identity, and can we preserve it, and can we preserve it with specific grapes and all the innovation that's going around right now with varietal innovation. So I would love to invite Etienne Neethling to the stage. Welcome.
Yeah, so good morning to everyone. It's difficult to speak after Monsieur Selos. I definitely don't have the same experience as him. But yeah, as Michelle has mentioned, so I'm originally from South Africa. If you want to ask where's my accent from, I've been living in France for the last 15 years. And I've studied for the last 10 years since my master's degree and my doctor's degree, climate change. And over time, I've learned about the challenges that wine growers are facing. We talk a lot about adapting the viticulture, but what about adapting terroir-driven wines and thinking about what are our greatest solutions, but also which makes us so sensitive to climate change. So about 2 years ago, I submitted a project, and I hope that this presentation can show you more or less my thinking. I'm very optimistic about what we have as solutions, not just the resilient nature of wine growers, but the amplitude of solutions that are possible. So I'm going to talk about varietal innovation, use a little bit the introduction to contextualize the study, and then hopefully give you a message that you can take home, and hopefully to look at some joint international approaches that we can put together and help the wine growers who are looking for innovative research proposals, and definitely policymakers that can help them and provide them guidelines for the future. So when we talk about the wine sector, we have a product that's produced locally, consumed globally. So obviously for the carbon footprint, that's one of our greatest challenges. But we have always placed a big importance on the variety that we cultivate and how this can create a message to speak about authenticity, about quality. And I know that Elaine Brown wrote recently a paper for Decanter. Jamie Good spoke about this when he talked about the importance of finding signature varieties. But basically it comes down to the fact that we're looking for varieties that can allow us recognition outside of the border of our regions. And if that variety is very well adapted to the local conditions, it creates this opportunity to meet different market segments, allowing value at the entry level, providing a simple message about the style, or just the average consumer that's looking for a simple message, but at the same time also being a variety that's adapted to the local conditions, and therefore providing a much more complex message where it's much more received and welcomed and understood. So today with climate change, we know that as climate is a critical and probably the most important factor that defines the ecologically fitted plant material that we plant in different areas, varieties at risk, and we are asking questions about what we will plant in the future, and what will be the most suited and the most adapted. And you will see in my presentation, I often talk about tolerance. I don't like the word resistance because I don't think there's any variety that's resistant to heat or drought, but we have different levels of tolerance. So as I made also the presentation yesterday, um, basically, there's compelling scientific evidence. We know that across wine growing regions, climate change manifests primarily through regional warming. We have differences. Northern Hemisphere wine regions often warm much more than Southern Hemisphere regions like New Zealand, or some of the wine regions in New Zealand. But we basically see this trend in all wine growing regions. And this is just a comparison to see that what was previously a cool climate in the Loire Valley has shifted now to a much more temperate climate. And we have in the Loire Valley, for instance, the historical climate of Bordeaux. And interesting, when we talk about drought and rainfall patterns, there's very little weather stations actually that showed significant changes in water rainfall amounts, even if we look at variables such as the number of dry days or wet days. And it comes back to the comment that was made before. We have this variability between wet and dry seasons. But what we are seeing is, despite maybe a constant amount of rainfall, agricultural drought has increased. And I don't have a data here, but we are seeing that soil temperature is actually warming at almost 2 times the rate as air temperature. And to show you just how important these shifts are taking place from a viticultural landscape perspective, this is 2 examples that I like to use, but because they are so contrasting, and when we think about Champagne and we think about the Rhone Valley, they're 2 very different climates. So this is just to show you on from a viticultural perspective, we have a large range of viticultural indices that we can use, and you can see on the horizontal axis the Euglin index. It represents the amount of heat accumulation that accumulates during the growing season, so in the northern hemisphere from April to September, and you can see on the vertical axis a dryness indicator, which will just basically tell us if the vintage was wet or dry, and the amount of water that the vine had access to. And you can see that for the period of 71 to 2000, which will be more or less the historical climate, we can see that Champagne is basically in a cool and wet climate, and the Rhone Valley has a more temperate, warm climate with variation between wet and dry growing seasons. Now, if we look at the shift for the last 20 to 30 years, we can see that basically the Champagne area are exposed to conditions that are much more Mediterranean, much more warmer, much more temperate. And that's where we start understanding how big the changes are actually taking place and how much the vines are exposed to conditions that are extremely new and challenging and taking place at a very fast rate. And that's the problem for the viticultural sector. We're dealing with a perennial plant. We have a long-term investment, and so decision making today is extremely important for the next 50 to 60 years, especially when we have this objective that a vineyard planted should belong to at least 2 generations of vine growers. And then just quickly to show you how much the vine is responding. So we're seeing advanced phenology under much warmer and drying conditions, and most importantly, these modifications in berry composition. So this is a network of Chenin Blanc vineyards in the Anjou area, but the results that I'm presenting here has been shown by many scientists all over the world. And we can see here for a common date, the 15th of September, which was in the 70s, 80s, maybe the beginning of the ripening. Today, it's more or less when we pick the grapes. In 2003 or 2022, we even picked before the 15th of September. But you can see here over the last 40 years, we have gained more or less 50 grams per liter of sugar for the same date, which corresponds to more or less 3 degrees of potential alcohol. And at the same time, the acidity has significantly decreased. And then, just quickly, I think we talk a lot about quality, but one of our biggest aspects that makes us so vulnerable to climate change are these more frequent and more intense extreme events, and definitely impacts the amount of volume that we produce. And 2001, for instance, when France had a very severe spring frost, which was the last time actually took place in 1991, we had very low productions, which was the lowest since the year 2000. So as I've mentioned, climate change adaptation is unavoidable. We're dealing with a perennial plant. But fortunately, climate change awareness and expectation is evolving. I think wine growers in the early 2000s didn't talk about climate change. I remember when I was doing my doctor's degree, no one actually, there was not something that felt normal to them, or they couldn't anticipate that the climate was changed so dramatically. But the last decade, I think the perception has changed. And in 2020, we did this study. We interviewed, as you can see, 3,636 wine growers from 18 different countries. You can see the countries that were involved, the number of questionnaires that we collected. We asked several questions. So this just allowed us to understand that there's a wide and yeah, a wide perception of climate change. There's countries like Canada or Great Britain, and I think New Zealand was one of those examples where the perception level was not so high as traditional countries like France or Germany, but we had 84% of the wine growers interviewed that mentioned that they are perceiving climate change. 81% of them are observing that phenology is advanced. As we are in Canada, I can share with you, actually in Canada, the wine growers didn't agree. They felt that there's no advances in vine phenology. So we're seeing that these impacts definitely are related to the local context of each vineyard. And then about 55% of the wine growers observed that there's much more, there's lower yields, especially wine growers from Mediterranean countries, Chile, South African or Mediterranean regions like the south of France. And then about 40% of the growers observed more diseases. So talking about perception and obviously considering different adaptation pathways, and especially the costs and the benefits that are involved in those different adaptation pathways, there's this varietal innovation that can be seen as some of the, obviously, in my perspective, among the most effective adaptation strategies that we can employ. It doesn't cost more by planting another variety or another rootstock. It definitely is something that is very cost effective. So today, when we talk about varietal innovation from a research perspective, there's two strategies that are commonly used. Either we will evaluate what are the different varieties that are existing within the family of Vitis vinifera, and as I've mentioned before, allowing us to look at varieties that are more tolerant to heat, more tolerant to drought, and then trying to introduce them into our, in our code of conduct, within our regulations, within our production systems, or the creation of new hybrid varieties, which has become, which has drawn a lot of attention, and Michelle has mentioned this in an introduction. There's definitely a large amount of hybrid varieties that are available, and we're even seeing today the hybrid versions of, let's say, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, in countries like Italy, that has been among the pioneers of creating these new hybrid varieties. So understand how big the diversity is that we have access to. We can visit a place like Indre-et-Vassal, which will be in the south of France, and that has more than 2,500 Vitis vinifera varieties, in addition to the growing number of hybrid varieties that are available and continuously available through different breeding programs. And then, as we consider these alternative varieties, we look how they can be suitable to expected climate conditions. And even today, varietal innovation is promoted by policymakers in a country like France, which is extremely traditional. Even our national body has opened the legislation allowing growers to innovate and experiment with new varieties without losing the benefits of the appellation, and which led, for instance, like a region like Bordeaux to include 6 new varieties within the code of conduct. And even in the Loire Valley, in a way to help and to provide solutions to growers to understand varietal innovation, you can look this up. I think this is probably the only region in the world that has such a free and available resource for growers, so it doesn't only allow them to understand how the climate is currently evolving, how it's expected to evolve, but they can also use this tool by selecting varieties, understanding past, current, and future phenological stages, ripening periods, and a way for them to be more proactive by anticipating the impacts that will take place by the middle or the end of the century. But for me, this is the topic that probably drew me to the subject that I will present to you now, is the uncertainty. I think there's a lot of uncertainty how the climate will evolve. Even if we have a lot of accurate models, we have increased knowledge, we understand more and more the behavior of the grapevine within its climate, but still there's a lot of uncertainty. And again, when we think about the investment of planting a vineyard, the cost involved, and thinking about risk management and how much decision making is necessary, this uncertainty is very difficult. And as I opened also my presentation, by replacing a signature variety that has created a local distinctiveness, the market is aware about that. We talk about identity, and now replacing it with a new variety, it can be seen as a very good agronomy solution, but it can also bring a lot of socioeconomic challenges that we don't expect and we don't anticipate. And this leads almost like to a concept called rebound vulnerability, meaning that the adaptation that we were putting into place actually makes us much more vulnerable. We don't know if the market will be willing to buy wine with a new variety, or even if the producer has the cultural knowledge to cultivate that variety and to make the same quality with the same expression. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I feel often that when we talk about our climate change, we don't deal with uncertainty, and we definitely don't integrate it in the discussion. So what I believe is when we look at uncertainty, we have to accept it. And uncertainty brings us to the place where we actually have to say, but we need solutions that are by nature no regret. They have a reversible a reversibility to itself, which increase the resilience of the vineyard, regardless of the climate of tomorrow. Meaning that the decisions I'm making today, even if tomorrow we don't have global warming, I will still be as resilient as possible, finding solutions that can be able to confront any climate scenario, if it's global warming or the natural variability. And this brought me to this subject called intervarietal diversity, and someone like Monsieur Selos, he can probably talk much more about this because this is the fundamentals of biodiversity. So what we wanted to do with this study is we wanted to understand to what extent can intravarietal diversity be an adaptation solution to climate change in the context of varietal innovation, where we're looking at alternative varieties that are strangers to their native regions, or the introduction of new hybrid varieties that have been newly bred through breeding programs. So what are we talking about? So let me take Shannon, as some of you understood yesterday, coming from South Africa, living in the Loire. I'm obviously a big supporter of Chenin Blanc, but we know today that Chenin Blanc, like many other varieties, come from two distinctive parents. And then when we take this variety, we will then propagate it vegetatively, and in most cases, that same plant that we propagate will have the same genetics as the initial parent. But then somatic mutations takes place. We have our regenerative cells that leads to these spontaneous mutations, and this leads to a family of clones. So we actually should see our varieties that are cultivated today as a population of clones that represents the variety. And our focus in the study that is funded by the National Agency of Research in France is to understand within the family of our varieties that we cultivate, how big is this diversity, and can this diversity be a climate change solution, especially within the context, again, of sustaining or maintaining local identity, and to make sure that Pinot Noir will always be in Burgundy. And the fortunate thing we have, if it's in France or in Italy, Portugal, all these European countries that has always placed a strong importance on the heritage of viticulture, and making sure that each individual clone or genotype has more or less a form of conservation and protection. So I'm going to give you the example, but we have 40 members in France that continuously invest a lot of money. Today we have more than 180 vineyards that are conserving this genetic material for different varieties. It represents 136 varieties, and this totals to more than 20,000 genotypes. I know that in Portugal they have a similar value, and the objective by the year 2030 is to have 50,000 genotypes that represents all the Portuguese variety. So a big resource of biodiversity, of biologically diverse genotypes. The problem is, if we look at data that we collect from national bodies, like for instance in France, it will be France Agrimaire that collects all the data coming from private and public nurseries. We actually have a lot of vineyards that are planted with the same clonal material. So very little biodiversity. If I take the case of Chenin Blanc, you can see that we have 4 clones that represent 94% of the vineyards planted since the year 2005. And I know by personal experience that we have more than 400 clones that are already conserved and protected within a vineyard in the Loire Valley. So a small percentage of clones representing the majority of vineyards planted. And this brings me to where I actually started to work on this topic. When we look at adaptation planning, There's different assessments we can do. We can look at what we call outcome of contextual vulnerability assessment. So this is a basic example of an outcome vulnerability assessment. We assess how the climate will change, how our system or our vineyard will be exposed to expected climate changes, and to what degree our system is sensitive to that changes, how we can cope with it. And if we can't cope with it, what are the solutions we have to make our system more resilient and less vulnerable? So the question I'm asking myself is, even if I'm a big supporter of the current research in looking at alternative varieties, and there's very interesting projects taking place, the example of Bordeaux with the project called VitaDapt, 52 varieties within the same vineyard. So extremely interesting projects. The amount of money we're investing in hybrid varieties. The question I'm just asking myself is, are we not moving too fast? Are we not a little bit too radical, and we didn't assess sufficiently our current vulnerability? The fact that we have one single clone within a vineyard means that we have the same climate sensitivity to spring frost, to drought. And the fact that we have so little biodiversity, it can maybe explain why we have such a great sun sensitivity. And this is a little bit in support to a study that came out in 2020. You can see that this team of research, they looked at the grapevine diversity at a Vitis vinifera level, and how they can reduce the loss of vineyards for both, let's say, more an optimistic and pessimistic climate scenario, 2 and 4 degrees warming. And you can see as they increase cultivar diversity, they can reduce the loss of vineyards. So the same question I'm asking, instead of combining vineyards, Viognier, Chenin, etc., is it not possible to increase the biodiversity from a clonal perspective, and can this be an adaptation solution? So we are working on a large database that is available. We have historical data and current data that we're collecting in the Loire Valley, but also in Alsace, in Bordeaux for different varieties. Our methodology is quite simple. We will then collect the data for phenological stages, bud, pith, flowering, and veraison. We will associate daily temperatures and then build phenological models that have both linear and nonlinear responses. And then we try to integrate within that understanding climate change scenarios, and how does the genetic diversity then respond to increasing temperatures, and can it be an adaptation solution? We're also very sensitive to the fact that we are working with phenotypic expressions. And as any breeder, we want to make a genetic promise and not a phenotypic promise. So we're looking also at the interaction between the environment and the genetic part of the genotype, to make sure that what we are modeling is also a promise that is genetically related to the plant, and regardless of the environment where we plant that genotype, it will have always the same response. So when we look at the region of Alsace, the variety Riesling, we have here a case of the clone 49, which is the most planted Riesling clone in France. I think it's about 30% of the vineyards are planted with clone 49. And here you can see the significant advances we have seen for bud, pith, flowering, and veraison for this single clone in the same vineyard from the 1960s. We also can see that not only the veraison period has advanced by a month, but also the duration between these phenological phases are shortening, which is also extremely challenging when we think about practices and the rhythm of the vine and the time that wine growers have available today. But at the same time, we have access to, as you can see, 344 clones of Riesling that were measured from 1982 to 1991, this gray part that I'm showing in the box. And you can see that we have 11 days of difference on average between the earliest and the latest developing clone. That's on average. Some years we can go up to 18, 19 days, which is almost 3 weeks between the earliest and the latest developing clone. So already that's interesting results showing us extremely interesting promises. And then, as I've mentioned to you, we are also looking at the heat requirements of each genotype. And in this case, I just displayed the results for the linear response model GAV, where you can see we go from heat units that are around 2,400 to almost 2,600, which is quite substantial. And then, what is interesting in this analysis that we did when we considered the population of Riesling, that the clone 49 is actually a medium developing clone right in the middle, as you can see by the fact that it has a veraison date on average around the day of the year 239. which will be close to end of August in that period of time. And then when we do the same for other varieties, so this is the example of Chenin Blanc. Again, you can see we had historical data from 1997 to 1999. We have a collection of, let's say, almost 60 clones that are common for the 3 years. We're currently evaluating more than 300 clones in the same vineyard, and we have the same differences. Year on average, we had 14 to 16 days of difference for Varietal. We're currently observing almost 17 to 18 days. And then what I wanted to show, and I think this is maybe one of the first promising results that we are seeing, you can see on your right side, you have the simulation of when Verizon will take place for an early and a late developing clone by the end of the century under the warmest possible scenario that the Loire Valley will be faced. And you can see that we have the spread, the temporal spread, depending on the year from 2071 until the end of the century. But basically, we can see that there's a shortening of the difference. We went from 14 days to 11 days in this case, and you can see the development of both clones by the end of the century. Now, if we look at the current understanding we have of varieties at a Vitis vinifera level, I took the example of Chenin and Uni Blanc, which we consider as a very late developing variety. And you can see Chenin here performs very similar to the early ripening clone that we have simulated, basically because the clones that are currently in the vineyards were selected and breeded or selected in the 70s when earliness was very important. And we selected, for instance, the clone 222, which ripened much earlier than other genotypes. But Uni Blanc, in this case, which will be the representative of a late ripening variety and potentially maybe an alternative variety for the Loire Valley to delay a little bit the ripening and move back to the autumn period. And you can see our late developing clone performs as well as a late ripening variety. So already maybe the outcome message is that there's diversity within varieties, and that the latest developing clones can be as late ripening clones. But again, and the question came up for Canada, and coming back to the concept of uncertainty, we can't just adapt to climate change. We have to consider that there's a lot of natural climate variability that takes place and will continue with global warming. And this is just to show you how this variability took place for the seasonal temperatures from the 1950s to the year 2020 in the Loire Valley. And you can see this range of temporal variability. And this is where the population of clones come in, the concept of polyclonal selection, where we have just a bigger chance that one of the genotypes will have the traits that allow that genotype to be able to perform against a certain climate scenario. And I think the message that, or I hope that our research will show that by increasing the intravarietal diversity, we can buffer much better, very challenging and new environmental changes, but at the same time also making sure that we don't make the error of the past. We don't want to just promote late developing clones, but to show also the value of early ripening clones, and not just from a population perspective or a polyclonal selection, but if you talk with a lot of viticulturists coming from warm and dry regions, and I quote specifically here Rosa Creer in South Africa, early ripening can actually be extremely beneficial in a very warm and dry climate. By ripening early, we don't only avoid the long and hot over-ripening period where we need a lot of heat to still ripen the grapes, but we also pick early to ensure that we have a post-harvest period. The vines can then go back and they can go back and rest and make sure they have enough reserves for the next season. So even early ripening can be a very interesting adaptation solution, but I think what we are showing here is that polyclonal selection, a mix of different clones, is definitely, from a biodiversity principle, something that we have almost forgotten. I think the transition from massal to clonal selection and how a population of clones that are specifically identified can buffer the system and make it much more resilient. And so I often have this question from a practical point of view, but how will that work in the vineyard? Some varieties like Chenin Blanc, which is extremely diverse, can maybe be benefit from different clones because we harvest them at different maturity levels, and this can make a complex wine. But what about red wine? What about phenolic ripeness? And the fact that clonal selection was also to make sure that the vine is behaving similarly within the vineyard and allowing the practices to be better managed. So I quote Antonio Graça, who I asked this question because in Portugal it's something that they have defended a long time. I think Portugal was the country that brought the polyclonal resolution to the OIV. And Antonio, he gave me this example. He told me, Etienne, there's always variability in a vineyard. It can be because some sites are more contrasting than other sites, but there's always variability. And he gave me this image of a single clone vineyard and the natural variability within the vineyard, explaining different phenotypic expressions, maybe more vigor, less vigor, bigger bunches, smaller bunches. And he said that we have seen with the Porvet Association that when we take a diverse population and we put it on a heterogeneous or very variable environment, actually it reduces the variability and it makes it much more homogeneous. So it's something that still needs to be tested, but I think it's something that is clear. We can see it from this graph, and any person that has worked in a vineyard understand that there's a lot of natural variability in a vineyard, not just the soil, but also the topography, the flow of the air, microclimates that vary very strongly from row to row, and a polyclonal selection that is imposed in a natural environment like that can actually reduce the variability from a practical perspective. But we don't want to stop there. We also believe that intra-variety diversity is not just in France. We have varieties in Europe that has been exported elsewhere. When we think about climate change and the unprecedented measures of climate change, we need unprecedented measurements. So we're looking today not only at the intra-varietal diversity in France, but also to countries that are serving almost like climate analogies for France, warmer, drier, and who cultivates the same varieties. So this is the case of Chenin Blanc, but we're doing the same work on Sauvignon Blanc, and we're hopefully going to do the same work on other varieties like Malbec in Argentina, or working more closely with colleagues in California. But as we look at this example, which is quite extreme, South Africa being about 3 degrees warmer, 2 times drier, we're looking at how the clones that have been selected in South Africa, how they compare with the clones that are French clones, because in the collection we have INRA ENTAF clones which have been taken from France and planted in South Africa. But South Africa definitely serves as an example to show how somatic mutations took place. South Africa as a country has Chenin Blanc since the beginning, since the 17th century in 1659 when we harvested the first grapes. So over time, these vines had to be more plastic, adapt to the local conditions, and this actually increased even more the genetic diversity of varieties that are grown elsewhere. And it will be again dramatic not to consider that plant material and to bring them back to France and to study them. And this is, I would say, the thing that I would like to maybe conclude on, and that's why I talked about joint ventures. I think coming together as a community like this event on tasting climate change, there's actually it's actually an interesting time. There's no one region, no one grower that is not faced with climate change. We all have the same objective. How can we implement climate actions to make us less vulnerable? How can we also promote our practices to be more environmental friendly? So there's a discussion that becomes much more internationally joined, because we all come together with the same challenges. So maybe common garden experiments is the way to move forward from an international perspective, joining forces and understanding the genetic diversity that exists. So being a South African, I'm also French, but loving rugby, I drew it on an example that I saw Laura Catena present at the Old Vine Conference, but using rugby as an example. So we know Antoine Dupont is the best rugby player in the world, best French rugby player. This is almost like the clone 169 of Cabernet Sauvignon. We don't debate. We know the attributes that this clone has. It can make beautiful wine. But Antoine Dupont, like clone 169, are not adapted to all the climate conditions. It doesn't have the fitness we're looking for in terms of yield production. So fortunately, rugby is played in France, and we can select the 15 best rugby players. This is our polyclonal selection. Polyclonal selection is making sure that we have the best genotypes among a population. And we have very good examples. I spoke with François Dalle, who will be a speaker tomorrow. In Sancerre, they have this approach. They went from 1,000 genotypes for Sauvignon Blanc to about 270. They then made a selection of what they esteemed was a selection of polyclonal clones that are more suited to a certain style and others that are more suited to another style, which they will call typicity and excellence. So they are very interesting movements, but again, this is quite unique. And I think there's still a lot of vineyards that are planted with the same clonal material. But in France, Cabernet Sauvignon, or Cabernet Sauvignon is not only cultivated in France, it's also in the international variety. And we have other clones elsewhere that are maybe as well as adapted as the French clones, but even better suited to more drought and more heat, as we can see here, the rugby players from the Southern Hemisphere. So a common garden experiment will be to understand not just the genetic diversity that exists, but bringing that vine material back within the same vineyard, evaluating the quantitative traits and providing a more dynamic approach to understanding climate change and making a selection that is more dynamic and answering questions in real time, and not just making a selection in the 1970s and hoping that that selection will suit all the climate outcomes or the climate needs we have today and even for tomorrow. And just in the US alone, we have 69 Cabernet Sauvignon clones that are circulating. So there's a lot of genetic diversity, intravarietal diversity that is present. And we are very fortunate in the wine sector because we understand clonal diversity compared to maybe other sectors like the apple, where we only talk about golden delicious. And this is something that we already started to do. In 2018, there was a French team that went to prospect vine material in South Africa. It came through quarantine in 2023. 15 new genotypes from South Africa, from the Skrifberg. For those who know this or don't know it, but Skrifberg is probably an area that is at the limit where dryland farming is possible, 3 hours north of Cape Town. For the Loire Valley, it will be an extremely worst case scenario from a climatic perspective. But so the Chenin Blanc genotypes came from that area. They were virus free. We planted it last year, and hopefully in the next 3 or 4 years, we can start comparing them and increase our own clonal garden and to understand the genetic diversity of Chenin. But this will be extremely interesting to do on other varieties. So our study is highlighting there's a strong phenotypic diversity. I think we also placed we're asking the question about biodiversity and how clonal diversification should be an attractive climate change solution, especially when we think about uncertainty, risk management, and almost helping growers to understand instead of uprooting a variety and planting or replacing it with another variety, there are solutions that they can use, but also to ask them the question, maybe they're sensitive because we didn't respect the principles of biodiversity. And there's opportunities for international communities to work together. If we take the example of Cabernet Sauvignon, it will be extremely helpful for both Napa and Bordeaux producers. So again, thinking about sustaining local identity within a global changing climate, such opportunities are necessary and very welcome as we are faced with unprecedented changes, but requiring innovative solutions. Thank you again, Michelle, for the opportunity. I obviously have to thank my the national organization that funds the study. It will finish in September next year. I'm also a professor, so I also want to thank the students because they helped me with the studies that we're doing. Thank you for your attention.
Any question in the room here? Please, all at the same time. OK. On a une question.
Well, thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation. How readily available is the information on earliness of clones right now? I mean, Ontave, which publishes the book, has many different factors of each clone, but I've never seen anything about earliness or heat requirements.
I think the best, if we look from, the best website will probably be a website called Plant Grape. Every variety that is possible to be planted, even for table wine in France, has to be in plant grape. There's also a website at a European level that provides all the genetic diversity that's possible. I think there's more than 30,000 genotypes in that website. But on plant grape, we will have a qualitative description. We will always use Chasselas as a reference, and we will say, but it will not be at a clonal level. And I agree with you. We understand varieties, Chenin Blanc, different varieties, but at a clonal level, no, information is not available. But however, when we do clonal selection, they go through a 5-year agronomy measurement period. The same for the enology will be 3 years. And the clonal selection obviously has the first principle of providing virus-free plant material. But clonal selection in France, in that question, is to bring diversity. So every clone that is registered as a new clone, moving from what we call accession to clone, has to have significant differences. So they can be sometimes phenology, but they can also be differences related to the ripening, the acidity, the sugar levels. But no, that understanding is very little available. And I think that's why our study is, I think, among the first that associate heat requirements at an intravarietal diversity. There's very interesting papers that were published in the last 10 years doing this analysis at a vitis vinifera level, understanding how much heat requirements Carignan will require compared to Syrah. So we are just basically following in the steps of that study. Again, I'm not doing something new. I'm just asking questions at a different level. And yeah, hopefully we will start to collecting sufficient data to understand the population and associate heat requirements at a genome or at a clonal level, and provide more helpful tools or information for producers to understand how they compare in phenology, but also how they compare from other quantitative traits. Because one of the quantitative traits, something that we are looking at doing this year specifically, is understanding also which quantitative traits are the most associated with the genetics. We know that each quantitative trait will have an environmental influence and an interaction between the genotype and the environment. And it seems that yield is among the quantitative traits that are the most associated with the genetics, whereas vine phenology can be explained 50 to 60% by the environment. So we also want to do that analysis by making a genetic promise and not just a promise that doesn't work in all environments.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm wondering if you have done, or if you know anyone else who has done studies on resilience that compare intra-varietal clonal selections in a vineyard versus a massal selection of the same variety in a vineyard, or a field selection that you would have in Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
Because in my experience, given the heat of the Douro and the adaptation of the vines there to that heat, the resilience of those vineyards, of the old vine vineyards, is often more apparent in the wines than in a lot of the new world vineyards that have been planted to individual varieties.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I would say Portugal is definitely advanced on that question. They have a very interesting association with more than 30 or 40 private members. Sograp, Esperau, all those companies belong to the Porvet Association, and they even have a back label where we can know if the wine was made from a polyclonal selection or a massal or a clonal selection. I would definitely, and I think this is why I mentioned Monsieur Selos, is that biodiversity from not just the viticultural perspective has been published as an extremely interesting solution to offset climate change and climate change variability. But from a viticultural perspective, I think there's very little studies that has been done on this field. Even if it's very apparent we always will, not, like we did yesterday, the tasting, we will ask the question, what clone was used, what rootstock was used. But there's definitely little variability from a clonal perspective. Studies that have looked at that specifically, I don't know if François Dalle has comments that he wants to make about Sancerre. I know about little teams that have looked at how polyclonal selection or a population of clones compared to single vineyard clones, and how they were sensitive or less sensitive to climate change effect or climate impacts.
And I know On a une autre question ici de ce côté.
Okay, that was fascinating and brilliant. The fact is that I wonder whether the outliers in terms of maturation, that maybe the target, are possibly also outliers in terms of taste or organoleptic qualities. I think, for example, of the comparison of Spätburgunder, Pinot Noir, and Frühburgunder, which is maturity shift in Pinot Noir. It's not exactly the same product. So did you taste that? Did you have some micro vinifications also?
No. Again, it comes back to a question also about funding, but no, we haven't tasted that. Often also the outliers come from, and that's where muscle selection, I believe, has limits. The more we have geographical locations where we are selecting and sourcing the genotypes, the bigger we can have diversity. It's true that some varieties has a tendency to create more clones than other varieties. Pinot Noir is a beautiful example of having not just ampelographic variability, but also a lot of different clones compared to Merlot, which will not have that same sensitivity to mutations and leading to clones. But I think what is the fortunate thing we have with the Chenin Blanc in that case, which is a vineyard that is not just sourced from Chenin Blanc coming from the Loire Valley and already having the differences between what we call the western and the eastern part, the metamorphic and the limestone geological sites. But we also source the Chenin Blanc from the Alps, from the south of France. So we're increasing the places where we can find Chenin Blanc, and by that hypothesis, we hopefully will have more genotypes that vary and that can provide us outliers. But now from a taste perspective, I can't exactly say how they will taste and how they will perform from an enology perspective. But yeah, that's probably the next step with the project. As a vineyard, I'm still quite young, so I can still work on the subject maybe for the next 20, 30 years, hopefully.
Le micro, s'il vous plaît. Oui, on a une autre question de ce côté-ci. Non, je ne l'ai plus. Oui, on en a une au fond là-bas. Merci.
Thank you for the nice presentation. So from a producer standpoint of view, taking into account that climate change is happening faster and faster, and replanting with clones, will they have enough time to adapt to the climate change instead of just switching to a more adaptable variety of grapes? So let's say in France, planting something that's drought resistant from like grapes from Spain, instead of playing with clones, which will take time to integrate in the winery cost, supplementary cost, instead of switching right away to something that's proven to be effective against drought or water.
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends from what region you're coming from. If you're coming from an emerging wine region where there's still not a signature variety and there's still the opportunity to innovate and to find a variety that's suited to the place, then yes, there's an invitation to play around with varieties. So we have the case in Brittany or Normandy as a new region that is emerging in France, and we can actually plant hybrids as we can plant Vitis vinifera and late or early ripening varieties. But in most cases, even new world countries are now established. They have a signature variety that's there. Even countries, as I've mentioned, South Africa, where we can take the case of Chile, Argentina, Australia, they have a heritage that's longer than 200-300 years, so 2-3 centuries. So they have genetic diversity. They already have a signature variety. And there's definitely options within the scope of the genetic diversity that's available. And my feeling is, I don't know how climate will outplay in the future. I think there's no one that really know how the climate will change. There's also a lot of other variables that makes this risk management very difficult to justify by replacing it with other varieties. So maybe the easiest, the no regret solution, which is more flexible, more reversible, even if next year is cold, wet, and you need an early ripening variety. I think working around the same variety but looking at the intervarietal diversity is definitely, for me, something that I will promote from a producer perspective. And then, using the population as a way to offset that variability and to give you temporal stability in the time. But now the question is, and I think this is something that we should look into, it's not just selecting a couple of cones that we believe are suited for the future, but also maybe maybe looking at how we can statistically accompany that, but maybe making analysis by saying that you need 40% of late developing clones, 30% of medium ripening clones, and then 20% of early ripening clones. And again, a common garden experiment allows us to ask these continuous questions because we have the introduction of new genotypes, but we're constantly asking new questions. So it comes back to experimental designs and how we then facilitate this question for the future. And today, in the case of France, if we look at clonal selection, it's a 30-year period. So what we're selecting today will only be available for the producers in the next 30 years. And by 2050, I know for sure the questions will not be the same as today, as the same is valuable to when the selection was done in the 70s. So we also need to think about how to create innovative ways to speed up this process, but also make experimental designs that are much more dynamic and not too slow to adapt to changing conditions.
Thank you. Do we have another question in the room?
Okay, thank you for your
Merci.
attention. Enjoy the conference.